as you are fighting. Because we know better, our society knows better than European societies what it means if tyrants already in your land. You know, how to defend, you know, your national identity, you know, your free media, from how to counter propaganda, because Russia is already in your countries. You know, through propagandistic messages, they're already poisoning the minds of your people just with narratives. Why do you have to sacrifice your comfortable life helping Ukraine or helping Belarus?
So there's an active debate about what we should do for Ukraine, and I think most people in this room will understand the contours of that debate. But when it comes to helping Belarus, what do you think Belarus's friends, the friends of the democratic opposition, should be doing? So in practical terms.
So we ask our countries, allies, and I see friends here on the stage, to stay consistent in the policy. Weaken the regime through political isolation, through policy of sanctions, closing all the possible loopholes, because still Belarusian regime continue to trade with Europe, they militarize our economy, they are supplying Russian army with the military staff that are buying from Europe. Just continue the policy of non-recognition of Lukashenko's regime, but on the other hand, help people, energize people for their fight, invest into Belarusian alternative media, into our civil society, help to strengthen agency of democratic forces. Look on us as on your counterparts, not Lukashenko. Lukashenko is a lost case. Belarus might be success story in our region. So look on Belarus not only as a problem, but as an opportunity to put pressure on Putin as well, because Belarus, with our consolidated society that is suppressed now, yes, with constant repressions, but it is the weakest point for Putin. It's the weakest, you know, chain, you know, for Putin. So through helping Belarusians to gain our country back, you know, to return democracy in Belarus, it will be the biggest sanctions on Putin ever.
General, I mean, we talked about the threat possibly extending beyond Ukraine, definitely. How prepared, as you look at Europe's military defenses, is NATO, is Europe? Because Mark Rutte, new in the job, gave a fairly, you know, I'm not searching for the right word, alarming speech in December, where he said, you know, we're short of what we need in military material and in men. How bad is the situation?
Well, first of all, I think it's much better than it's been in many years. The situation is there have been a variety of changes inside the military structures of NATO that have been authorized by the heads of state and government, and they make a very big difference. For example, we have the family of plans now. We have the first detailed defensive plans for the alliance to conduct collective defense that we've had in decades, 3 decades, almost 4. So that makes a huge difference, and that gives us the requirements that we have to lay out. The second thing I would say is there's a level of political focus on the challenge and the threat. There's a level of political focus on meeting the challenge and the threat. These 3 gentlemen accepted. It is not a given 5 years ago that you would have heard this from 3 heads of government or state in NATO. There just was not that sense of urgency. You hear it here today, and there's a good reason for it. So we have all the right things in place. When we also attempt to help Ukraine with material assistance, we run into some limits on our production, on our ability to produce new and modernized material. And that's what the SecGen was talking about in that speech especially. And I think it's an important thing that we've got to get after. I very much salute those nations that maintain vibrant defense industries. We're relying on them at this point, but that is something that we're working on as an alliance. And the EU is working on it very hard as well.
And in terms of just sheer numbers of troops, you know, the British Army is at the smallest size it's been since, you know, the late 18th century.
Yep.
Do we need to do something about that?
It depends on the military that we're talking about. So for the general plans that we have adequate numbers of organizations. Whether they're completely full or not really depends on the exact country we're talking about. It's hard to make a blanket statement. Some nations have extremely robust recruiting programs. Some nations have some work to do on the recruiting program. Some nations maintain conscription or have returned to conscription. Two of those nations are on the stage right now.
Right. Okay.
So,
yeah.
I mean, can I just on the troop issue and about the place where NATO is? I mean, General Cavoli mentioned 5 years ago there wasn't a sense of urgency. I think 5 years ago, if someone had asked Ulf and myself, will Finland and Sweden ever join NATO, the answer would have been no. But with us coming in, and on the Finnish part, you get a country which has obligatory military service. We have 900,000 men and women in the reserves. We have 280,000 that we can mobilize at wartime. We have 62 F-18s. We just bought 64 F-35s. We have the biggest artillery in Europe together with Poland. And we have long-range missiles in land, air and sea.
Do you think the rest of Europe, dare I say it, Belgium, but everyone, you know, France, Britain, need to follow your example?
It depends a little bit on your geographic location. And I understand, you know, if you're Belgian and say you're surrounded by France, Germany and Luxembourg and the Netherlands, it's not exactly like you're going to feel extremely threatened, you know. And I always say we don't have these things because we are worried about Stockholm. So you know, the bottom line is very much that geographic location defines geopolitics and then the military strategy that you take. I'm just extremely thankful that the leaders of the time when the Cold War ended didn't run down our military. But now we are also ramping it up. And I do think, and I sense urgency here. One thing I'd like to raise is that the issue that I'm worried about is I think we're moving to technological warfare. And I think that not only the Ukrainians are a step ahead of us, which I think is great, but the Russians are adapting to a new situation as well. So we really need to think about collective defense comprehensively. It's not only sea, air, and land, and cyber, and space. It's also just raw technology and new modern form of warfare. And the advancements are so quick that all of us need to be alert to that.
May I just answer that? I mean, geography really matters, and it's kind of trivial to say that, but if you have the longest border to Russia, as Finland has, or the longest coastline to the Baltic Sea, as Sweden has, you know, it defines our thinking on security, and that is self-evident to yourself, but it demands you to also think about the others. What are other allies' security concerns, to understand and to respect them as well. And I think one signal that is clear is actually if European NATO countries want the US to stick committed to what's happening in Europe, we also need to be committed to other US security concerns as well, like understanding what's happening in the Pacific, for example. It's obvious not in our neighborhood, that's obvious, but it's also in our kind of collective interest to defend in a broader sense. But your basic question, I think what has changed, I mean, there's a change of mentality, there is a sense of urgency, and resources are now being deployed in a way we didn't do previously. So that has changed. And then we have learned that it takes time. You know, conscription takes time, to educate soldiers takes time, to do procurement takes time, to enhance the capacity of the industry takes time. Can I say, still being a country with a pretty big defense industry in Sweden, everything takes time when we are in a sense of urgency.
Prime Minister, I know you want to comment on that. Can I also, since the US has been brought up, I think we've gone 20 minutes without saying the word Donald Trump, but I will say it now. He has said that NATO needs to actually think about 5% spending of GDP on defence. Is that a helpful intervention, or does it just make people in Belgium go, well, that's impossible, we're never doing that?
Well, let's be clear, we've increased quite significantly our investment, and we have a long way to go to get to our obligations, and I think all of us have to do an effort. That's an input metric, though, and input metrics are important. If you don't input investment, nothing's going to happen. Still, we have a long way to go on the output as well. And just comparing other weapon systems, if you go across all weapon systems, so you take planes, helicopters, tanks and so on, United States in total, they have 30 weapon systems. In Europe, we have 178. We have a long way to go to rationalize our industry, to allow M&A activity in military industry. Our military industries are all very national. This was like this last beacon of sovereignty. All of our military would buy on a very national level. And cross-border M&A activity, all of us were very, very prudent because all those firms are sometimes in a difficult situation. Finally, this is starting to move. We'll do more public spending, but if you want that public spending to be useful, we will also need more private spending in the defense industry. Today, we have a total lack of private spending in the defense industry, for example, because of ESG rules. I'm not saying we should put the ESG rules in the dustbin. We still need them. But if you say that environmental, social, and governance is important, then maybe we should say that investing in security is something that makes sense as well. Today, a big part of the private spending that you need to come to this industry, which is doing military work, but which is also crossing over into the more civilian part, today in Europe, this is totally lacking. And so there's a discussion about input, but it goes way beyond just, is it 2, 3, 4, 5%? There's way much more work to be done to come to something which is supporting our security concerns.
Yeah. And if I could, come back to the Prime Minister's point about inputs and outputs, one of the big things that's changed in the last couple of years, Gideon, is that these plans have given us requirements because we can now state, I require these forces to be able to execute this plan. The inputs are now matched by an output metric that we can build toward. And in that sense, the percent of GDP goal loses a little bit of salience because we have actual physical outputs that we want. However, it doesn't erase that goal because I can assure you that fulfilling those requirements is well in excess of 2%. So it's there's plenty to spend.
Yeah. Now, President Stubb, you mentioned that the Finnish media, not just the Finnish media, everybody is very focused on what's happening in Washington right now, the speech last night, the flurry of executive orders. Just taking one step a little back, I mean, the question of America's commitment to NATO under Trump is clearly in question. What's your reading of the situation? Well,
my reading on NATO and actually Ukraine is that the commitment is still very strong. And on NATO, I mean, my observation is that Trump was right already in 2016 when he demanded allies to increase their defense expenditure. I guess the stat that a lot of people use now is that in 2014 there were only 3 allies at the 2% mark. And now in Washington, D.C. last summer, we were 23. And we are all hiking up our defense expenditure. And I think one of the big issues in the next few months, promoted by President Trump, is that, okay, what's the level that we're going to have? What are we going to set in the NATO summit in The Hague in the summer? And I think General Cavoli talked about NATO requirements. If we were to fulfill those NATO requirements, we would already be talking something north of 3%. My point is that we all feel the pressure to increase not only the percentage, but also what we actually have, because it's not the percentage that matters, it's the content of the percentage.
But when you see Trump round on a NATO ally like Canada and suggest that it shouldn't even be a sovereign country, how can you really believe that the underpinning of friendship and values and history is still there?
Yeah, I think here's where we come to the big picture. I mean, we've had multiple conversations over the years. I think that the world order is changing. And, we can find a date for that. But for me personally, it was the 24th of February when Russia went for its full-blown attack on Ukraine. And we are in a situation whereby the core institutions, norms and rules of the liberal international order are under threat, or at least under challenge. And now, of course, that Trump comes in, I think it's going to be pretty much a battle of multilateral cooperation versus multipolar transactionalism. And what we have to look at in Europe is that, okay, how can we still ground American foreign policy in the interests of Europe, and how can we still work on key substantive issues with the US also in international organizations. And I think NATO for us, it's a very selfish approach. NATO for us is the most important one because we obviously see that US engagement in the UN is a little bit on the limited side.
Okay, any thoughts from Belgium or Sweden on how we keep America on side, essentially?
Isn't it, I mean, to some extent, politics is always, to some extent, transactional. You need to do things for your own country that is basically good for your country, for your citizens. You know, you have voters in your country, not in other countries. So it's more like kind of the time, you know, it's a matter of time. I think our experience is by sticking together between the Nordic countries, when times are good and when times are worse, in the long run, you gain something very important. You have friends to rely on, basically. So I think that kind of culture is not old-fashioned. I would say it's still valid. It works very well. But of course, you need to prove that you actually do things that is in the long run successful to your own country. So in that sense, and I think speediness is bigger today. There are expectation of reaching results pretty fast. And finally, if democracies want to be, you know, to be considered as very legitimate and successful, they need to be able to prove they solve problems. If democracy is just legitimate but don't solve problems, then we have a huge problem.
But Belgium, you know, when I lived there a while back, it was always almost the most federalist country in the European Union, the one that was always saying, Europe's got to do more on its own. Do you think the vision of the challenge from Trump means that Europe is going to really have to get its act together in the way that maybe the Belgians have been arguing for a long time?
But that has been going on for the past years. I mean, we didn't need Trump to know that as Europeans we need to stand on our own legs. We can't be dependent on other parts of the world for our security. We can't be dependent on other parts of the world for semiconductors or for energy. I think that process has been going on for some time. Now, on the fact that you have a new president, what we have to do is be careful to not every day be in a reactive mode. And it's quite easy to do so. I can imagine that every day there is something coming from Washington that we feel that we should react on. I don't think we should, because that puts us in a reactive mode, and that's not the position we as Europeans want to be. Though I think that sometimes we do have to react. For example, I mean, if Turkey, which is also a NATO ally, would talk about the Greek islands the way the United States have talked about Greenland, I think we would all be furious. So I think that on certain occasions we have to be clear and say, look, this is unacceptable, and this is a red line. I think beyond all the statements and all the communication, maybe you also need to look at some of the concerns of the United States, and some of those concerns, I think, are legitimate concerns. The United States have had a trade deficit for years now with Europe. That is an issue. I think we should address it. And I think we should find moments where you find things that make economic sense and that also make geopolitical sense. We want to detach from Russian gas. We should do it faster than what we're doing today. Well, maybe one of the options is just buy more LNG in the United States. It would help on the trade deficit from a geopolitical point of view. It makes sense. I could imagine that in semiconductors, we can match geopolitics and economics, and you can do that in defense spending as well. That, I think, is the real work. It's not reacting on the tweets and the statements and so on, but some of the concerns of the United States, I think we need to acknowledge that they are legitimate concerns, just as we Europeans also, I think, have legitimate concerns which we should communicate.
Interesting. Okay, well, there are loads more issues. I'd love to come up with talk a bit more about the sabotage, which General Cavoli mentioned, but I would also like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So, anybody want to stick their hand up? Yeah, just in front of me there. If you could say who you are, that's always helpful. And
thank you very much. I'm a journalist from Chinese media, Caixin, and I'm wondering that it seems that the Donald Trump administration has already shown some inclination to invite China into the potential negotiation process for Ukraine. So what will be yours, the European leaders, your candidate suggestion towards Chinese side when regarding the China's role in the following up process, especially when it comes to Europe want to contribute to a fair, just, and reliable
Who wants to take that one? I won't ask all five of you to comment all around.
Okay. Well, I think there are three key principles when we're dealing with any kind of a settlement on Ukraine. The first one is independence, the second one is sovereignty, and the third one is territorial integrity. In my mind, Ukraine must retain and maintain its independence. In my mind, Ukraine must retain its sovereignty. In other words, it has to have the right to choose whether it wants to join NATO and or the European Union. And of course, the territorial integrity is a key element of international law. I don't think there should be peace in Ukraine without Ukraine. I don't think there should be peace in Ukraine without Europe. There might be a transaction at the end of the day.
And can China play a role, though? I mean, do you trust the Chinese? Because some people think they're so close to Russia.
In October, I had the privilege of spending 3.5 hours with President Xi Jinping in Beijing on a state visit. And of course, our agenda was mainly focused on Ukraine and Russia. And my plea to him was, because he's in such a strong position with Russia right now, that if he wants to be a peacemaker, he can influence Putin. But that, of course, does not mean that the final peace settlement will be a Chinese or a Russian peace settlement. We'll see what President Trump and General Kellogg come up with. I think 24 hours has become 3 to 6 months. I think that's the window of opportunity where we see things happening. I also have the privilege of having a one-on-one with President Zelensky tonight, so I'm sure I'll be wiser after that.
Okay.
But of course, as long, I mean, I agree with that, but as long as China is so obviously enabling Russia's war against Ukraine, it's hard to see any kind of fast ways for including them right now. Nobody would be happier than me if China could become a constructive part of that peace, but you know, at least it has to start with not enabling the war.
Yeah.
Impact on Russia is the key.
Right, okay. There's a bunch of people behind me. Does anybody want to ask a question in this section of the room? No, I think we're okay here. Yeah, over there.
Hi, I'm from the Philippines. I just wanted to ask, less from the perspective of China towards Ukraine and Russia, but do you think there are any parallels from your discussion tonight with regards to what's happening in Asia Pacific and also all over the planet? And just wondering if you think that there's any, I guess, universal lessons or values or anything that could be drawn that we should be
General, do you want to take that
one?
Yeah, sure. I think the universal lessons, you know, go to what President Stubb talked about a minute ago. Independence, territorial integrity, sovereignty, the interconnection of all those things. Those are just fundamental to international relations and responsible behavior among states. So if we start from that, there are plenty of lessons to be learned from this conflict, and there are plenty of echoes that we see in other parts of the world. You know, some of them are very obvious, some of them are a little bit more subtle. I think what is very much a transportable lesson from this conflict is the importance of military strength, to go to the name of your panel, Gideon, the importance of military strength to maintaining peace and to reestablishing peace when peace fails. I think that's fundamental. I think you hear that in the words of everybody around this roundtable this evening, and I think it's a realization that we've come back to as a collection of democracies recently as a result of this war.
Okay. Now, an issue that's come up a little bit is the sabotage campaign in the Baltic Sea. I'd be interested, you know, we've got several people who have an interest in that. Actually, General, sorry again, what's happening as far as you know?
Sure. The Russians and before them the Soviet state have a long history of using what they called active measures to destabilize potential adversaries. And I believe that's what we see going on. This is a destabilization campaign. It's intended to intimidate the nations that are the subjects of it. It is intended to affect our decision making, and it's necessary to protect ourselves against it and stand up to it, which is exactly what individual nations are doing. Here I very much salute Sweden and Finland for their actions over the last year in this regard, and it's necessary for us to stand up collectively as well. NATO has done exactly that. As you know, we've stood up a special operation in the Baltic Sea in the last couple of days. We did it on just a couple of days' notice in order to protect allies from this sort of behavior and to work with sovereign nations, members of the alliance, as they apply their own legal authorities to the problems that are.
So what specifically is that force in the Baltic Sea doing?
Well, it's making sure we know everything that's going on the sea and in the sea and above the sea in the Baltic, and then directing the relevant information to the competent authorities. As you know, in these questions, it's a very complicated jurisdiction. Some of it's commercial property, some of it's state property, some of it's taking place inside national boundaries, some of it's taking place in international boundaries. So the key thing we can do is pass the relevant information to the correct authority, or if we are required to take action ourselves.
President Stubb, I mean, our undersea cables, is that basically what we're talking about, and the threat that communications cables are going to be cut?
Yeah, I mean, we have a very vast critical infrastructure in the Baltic Sea. Some of it's data cables, other energy cables, can be gas or electricity. And, you know, Ulf and I experienced in the past year 3 incidents. In the first particular case, about a year plus ago, it was a Chinese ship that dragged its anchor and tore a couple of cables. Then about a month and a half ago, there was one in close to Swedish territorial waters. And we were able to board that ship, but not take it on board. And then the final case happened on the 25th of December, very close to Finnish territorial waters. And we put in front an operation which then later on became, I guess, called the Finnish model. And the key here is that the private sector, in other words, the provider of the cable, informs the authorities. And this happened within about an hour, hour and a half. After that hour, authorities located the 2 possible ships that could have been the case, identified one, took one of our military or coastline ships close to it, then helicopters to hover over, saw that the anchor was down, stopped the ship, and ordered it to move to Finnish territorial waters for investigation. And everything worked out really well. It was pretty much a 24, 48-hour operation. And the key authorities there are the border, the customs, police, and the Navy. And we were able to contain it. And that's why we then decided, together with Estonia, Sweden, and the other Baltic Sea states, to have a summit meeting on the 14th of December, together, of course, with NATO, led by the Secretary General, where we announced the Baltic Sentry operation of NATO, where we announced action on critical infrastructure, and where we announced action on taking care of the shadow fleet. So in many ways, I think successful operation, well, not on the ground, but in the sea, and then also hopefully strategically communicating very clearly to Russia and others that don't do this again.
There is a discussion going on right now, not least in intelligence kind of circles. Can you prove it's intentional? You know, that's a legitimate question. And normally, you know, it's very hard to prove things being intentional. On the other hand, you can say, we don't believe in, you know, that randomly things just starting to happen. Vessels suddenly starting to drag their anchor for tens of kilometers, you know, and so when things start happening that are very unlikely, they might not be so unlikely. So you need to take this very seriously. We don't easily throw out accusations, of course, as governments, but we do take it very seriously, and the potential damage is equally big, regardless whether it is intentional or, as they put it, very bad seamanship. Yeah. Because if cables and electricity is being cut off, you know, it has really serious consequences.
And are there also risks that you actually might have fatalities from some of this? Because another thing that people have pointed to is these bombs that have been put on
I'm more worried about an environmental catastrophe. I mean, the reason we need to contain and control the shadow fleet is that a lot of the ships are very old, kind of run down, and they have a massive of oil. So we're really worried about our Baltic Sea, that something might be happening there. And I think it's in the interest of all of us around the Baltic Sea, including Russia, that it doesn't get contaminated. But now we come to the question earlier from the Philippines, freedom of navigation. So one of the things that we decided also to do is to look at the different measures in which we can prevent these types of events from happening without violating international law. It's a complicated matter.
So let me just finish, because we've only got about 4 minutes left, by talking specifically about the situation in Ukraine. It looks from reports that Russia has been advancing slowly. How do you see the war evolving over the next year, General? I mean, are you worried that Ukraine could lose quite rapidly?
No, I'm not worried that Ukraine could suddenly lose. I don't see the potential for a massive breakdown or massive breakthrough. And that's not a political, that's a military judgment. And it's got to do with both sides, the effective defenses that the Ukrainians have been putting in, but also the difficulty that the Russian side has in generating significant offensive forces to be able to exploit a potential breakthrough. So I think we'll see a lot more of the same sort of incremental advances we've seen. They are exhausting for Russia. I mean, there's a reason Russia brought thousands and thousands of soldiers from North Korea in to help fight. It's because Russia also is having manpower problems. So I think we'll continue to see this tension between a desire to advance and the shortage of manpower on the Russian side. I think that will define much of the conflict, and it will push the Russians to use a lot more standoff weapons, as you've seen them increasingly do over the past years. Destructive weapons, but rarely decisive weapons in terms of overturning a government or imposing a complete defeat.
But if this is the last big package of USA, the last one was passed, if no more comes through, does that change the situation?
Well, first of all, I think, that's a hypothetical that we've got to be careful with. But secondly, I would call attention to the very significant uplift in European aid that's been sent, especially in terms of munitions. There has been a significant increase in the output of artillery shells and rockets from our European allies who have been contributing in huge numbers to Ukraine. And I expect to see that continue, and I expect to see it increase as well.
Okay, so from the European leaders here, if America pulls back even a little bit, is Europe capable of filling the gap and keeping Ukraine in the fight?
Maybe let's take a step back. What would be the advantage for Mr. Trump to pull back? Exactly. Would it be to say, Mr. Putin, you were right and you won? I find that a very hard argument for him. So, and you say that there's a military judgment. The military judgment is linked to political judgment. That is a core political judgment. There's none of the European countries that want to say, Mr. Putin, go ahead, you did this with Ukraine. Now you wait 2-3 years to replenish yourself, and then you have a go at another European country. There's no European country that would agree to it. And I have a hard time to believe that that would be a strategic objective of the United States.
But there are two short answers. One is, yes, we can do more. We can do more as Europeans. And our strongest argument to the US to make them stay committed is for the Europeans to be role models. That's the only way for us to really be trustworthy when we ask the Americans also, American taxpayers, please stay committed to what's happening in Ukraine.
President? Fully agree. Look at it from Putin's perspective. This was supposed to be over in 3 days. We're into it for 3 years. He was supposed to make Ukraine Russian. It's European. He was supposed to keep NATO at bay, stronger than ever. He was not supposed to get NATO on his border, just doubled the border of NATO through Finland and later on with Sweden. So we'll just have to keep at it.
And from Belarus, are you confident that in the end Putin is going to lose, or do you think he could win?
You are talking so much about weapon, physical weapon, but I have to say that a weapon is senseless without brave people. So let's think first of all about investment to people, you know, you know, because I'm here just in a little bit different position because I'm a nation that needs support and your countries who are providing support. And I believe how it's important not to lose trust into your allies, not to get this feeling of being betrayed at the moment, you know, because when you have this, you know, sense that you are abandoned, you are forgotten, that countries don't pay attention, you know, to you or not keep you in focus, it's really demoralize people and they lose trust into democracy. And it's very important, they lose trust in neighbors. And it's not only about Belarus or Ukraine, it's about members of European Union as well, because now I live in Lithuania. It's a wonderful country, very brave, principled, but when I'm talking to Lithuanians, they're also not sure, just in the case Russia will come to Lithuania, that NATO alliance will come and protect them. So because they see that, you know, assistance to Ukraine, you know, is decreasing, so not so much attention, so they really want to, I want you to keep trust in each other. This is important. You might have, you know, dozens of tanks and helicopters and so on and so forth, but if people don't believe in your capability, you know, to support each other and come and rescue your ally, so everything is senseless. So contribute, you know, invest into people.
Thank you. That's a very good note to end on. So thank you to the entire panel and to the audience. That's it for now.
Thank you.